Hi everyone, it's Miss Pacha, and in this video I'll be reading section 2.4, Colonization to Independence. It's on pages 376 and 377 in your online textbook, so let's get started. Main idea. European powers colonized and ruled large parts of Africa until Africans began independence movements in the mid-1900s. So that's like 1970s onward. As you have learned, the Portuguese began exploring the African coast in the 1400s. By the 1500s, many European nations were seeking to control large parts of Africa. Imperialism and colonialism. Imperialism is the practice of extending a nation's influence by controlling other territories. European imperialism in Africa began when Europeans started trading with slave merchants on the coast. So remember that in the last reading, I explained that triangular trade from the continent of Africa to North and South America, and then to the continent of Europe. So as background, remember that in this reading. European imperialism in Africa began when Europeans started trading with slave merchants on the coast. Little by little, Europeans moved into African lands in search of profitable resources. Eventually, several European countries conquered African lands and established colonies. The practice of directly controlling and settling foreign territories is known as colonialism. So let's think about this in something that you already know about. In the United States, the 13 colonies were controlled by England, and England took over the 13 colonies by force from the people that already lived here originally, the Native Americans. So that was an example of colonialism, is the beginning of the United States. However, then the people that were living here as colonists started to feel like they weren't supported by England anymore, and then we had the American Revolution, which led to our independence. However, in Africa, the European countries that came in that established colonies and controlled different parts of Africa were in control of these regions of Africa for way longer than what happened in the United States. By the mid-1800s, European powers began to fight over their African colonies. They wanted more natural resources to fuel industrialization or the transition to large-scale industries in Europe. So at this time in the 1800s, in Europe, lots of factories were developing. Machines started to develop in order to produce things faster. And so they wanted the natural resources of of Africa, because the natural resources in Europe were getting depleted, or they were starting to go away. Because of the advanced European weapons, there was little the Africans could do to stop them. So Europeans, because they had these machines from the Industrial Revolution, they had guns and other weapons that other places in the world did not have. So it allowed them to take control of these different regions of Africa. Scramble for Africa. In 1884, Europeans held the Berlin Conference to settle their disputes about colonial claims in Africa. No Africans were invited to attend. So the people that the European colonies were controlling didn't even have a say in what was going to happen to their land and their people. Europeans at the conference divided Africa amongst themselves, again, without any influence of African voices. By 1910, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Great Britain, which is England, had established themselves as colonial powers in all parts of Africa. So if we look at the maps to the side, you can see that all of Sahara and Sub-Saharan Africa was divided amongst these Europeans and their countries. But again, the Africans had no say in the borders that were developed and who was going to be controlling this land. Many Europeans believed that African culture and religion were inferior to those of Europe, so they thought it wasn't as important or greatly valued as their own culture, traditions, and religions. They wanted to change African traditions. Europeans sent missionaries, people sent by a church to spread their religion among native populations to convert Africans to Christianity. So, one way that Europeans knew that they could start to control the people that lived in Africa better was by converting them to their own religion. So, to give them a common shared cultural like space and thing that they all practice. So they sent these missionary groups to Africa in order to convert them to Christianity, which then started to take away African cultures and religions. African independence. In the early 1900s, Pan-Africanism, a movement to unify African people, grew among African leaders in London and other cities around the world. By the 1950s and 60s, this nationalist movement had brought together many African leaders. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana helped to gain independence for their people. So the people that lived in Africa that were true Africans started to get really, really upset with what was happening, that they had no control of their land, of their countries, and the European people did. So this movement of Pan-Africanism developed in order to gain independence for the people that lived in Africa from the European controllers. In 1963, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, was founded to promote Pan-Africanism. The OAU is known today as the African Union, the AU. It continues to promote African unity and cooperation, but also functions as an economic group similar to the European Union. So we learned about the European Union in our Europe unit. So the AU, the African Union, is very similar. It allows all the countries to have representation in Africa, which they didn't historically have. So if we look at the maps at the top of the page on 377, you can see that the European colonies in 1938 controlled all of this region, and each color represents a different country. And then as the African countries started to gain independence and become free from their European colonizers, all of these countries developed. So you can see that like French West Africa, which was a really large region, slowly became separated by different countries. And that's because there are different cultural groups in these different regions that were clumped together by Europeans that had no understanding of the differences amongst the people, and that there was historical implications on it, where the people that lived in these clumped up regions developed by the Europeans may have had tensions in the past. And that led to these African countries not being able to be as successful as other countries in the world because they were controlled by someone else. So what you're going to do is move on to the Google Doc after listening to this reading, and this ends the readings for the week of April 20th to the 24th, and I'll see you next week in our next readings.